Welcome to Horseshoe Politics. Today is September 27th, 2020, and I would like to continue off of yesterday's video where I started talking about the Trump versus Biden polls and comparing them to Trump versus Clinton polls. I started off yesterday by talking about how accurate the 2016 polls really were, and I was going to do a second part to that video, but I did not have enough time to finish that part of the video, so I thought I would just leave that part of the video to today's video. So in this video, we're going to start by talking about how Trump and Biden are currently doing in the polls right now, and compare that to how Trump and Clinton were doing against each other back in 2016, around this time, September of 2016. So in a second, I'm going to pull up the Trump versus Biden polls from the last 3 weeks, and then we're going to take a look at that, and then we're going to take a look at the Trump versus Clinton polls from 4 years ago. So let's begin with that now. As of now, the election is just a little more than a month away. Today is September 27th, and actual election day takes place on November 3rd. So it's just a little more than 5 weeks away until actual election day. Here's the thing though, a lot of people have already voted because of mail-in ballots. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people thought that it was not a good idea to vote in person, it was too unsafe, so they just decided to cast their votes by mail this year. And because of that, you're going to have an unprecedented amount of people voting by mail in this election cycle. And because of that, you already have almost 1 million people who have already voted as we're speaking right now on September 27th. If I remember correctly, the number's around 860,000. And I was just reading about something today. It talked about how, as of now, 860,000 people have already cast their votes because of mail-in voting, but at this exact time 4 years ago, only 10,000 people had casted their vote. And that just shows how many people are actually doing mail-in ballots this year, and it makes sense. Because the pandemic's there, it makes sense that they would cast their vote by mail, because a lot of people don't feel safe voting in person if they're not able to properly socially distance at the polls, and if not everyone's wearing a mask, then it can be pretty unsafe, so I completely understand that. But let's actually get to the polls now. I just thought that was something interesting to point out. So, if you look at the polls from 2016, we're going to start with that. You have Clinton up by anywhere from 2 to 4 points in most of these polls. Some of them have her up by 5 to 6 points, but then you also have a few polls having Trump up by around 2 points, with one outlier having Trump up by 5. But if you take the average of all these polls, it would average roughly around Clinton being up by 2 to 3 points, I'd say, maybe like 2 points. And that's actually roughly around what she got on election day in the popular vote nationwide. She got 2 points above Donald Trump, 2 percentage points better than Donald Trump on actual election day 2016. So what this means is that the polls from 2 months before the election, the ones from September, they can actually be a relatively good indicator of what election day will actually be like in many instances. But it's not going to be a perfect indicator because there's still a lot of room for things to change between September and November. Like, as of now, none of the debates have happened yet. The debates could completely change up the dynamics of the Trump versus Biden presidential race. So we have to still wait to see how that goes. But let's actually take a look now at the Trump versus Biden polls that have been issued in the last few weeks. Let's look at those results and let's compare them to the Trump versus Clinton results of 2016. So as you can see in the left column, all the polls that I'm showing on screen right now with Trump versus Biden, they're all from just the past 3 weeks. The earliest poll on screen is from early September. I think September 6th is the earliest poll currently on screen. But if you look at most of these polls, Biden is up by quite a bit, actually. Not a single one of these polls shows Trump winning. Actually, one of them, my bad. One of them shows Trump winning just by a single percentage point. But every other poll on here shows Biden winning against Trump. Most of them show Biden winning by several percentage points at that. Some of them show Biden winning by up to 10 percentage points. So this means that Biden is clearly doing better in September of 2020 than Hillary Clinton was doing against Trump, against the same opponent, back in September of 2016. What I think we can conclude from this is that Biden is objectively doing better than Clinton did 4 years ago. And that means that I would say that Biden definitely has a better chance of winning this election than Clinton did back in 2016. And the fact that Clinton almost won back in 2016, I think shows that Joe Biden has a really good chance of winning this election. He definitely has a better chance of winning this election than Clinton did back in 2016. And Clinton almost won in 2016. She just neglected 3 states in the Rust Belt, 3 states that she was expected to win, but then Trump was able to surprisingly flip to his side. And those 3 states are what gave Trump the election But all the polls in those states are showing Biden up by several points as of now. And that's actually what we're going to get to now. We're going to talk about the state polls in a second, the national election polls, but like within each state. Mainly the swing states, because the swing states are what actually determine the election because of the current election system. I made a video talking about how we need to change the electoral college so that more states matter, so that's not just the swing states that matter. You can check that video out if you want. But for now, we're just going to look at the polls that were taking place in the swing states. And then we're also going to look at how accurate the state polls are for determining the winner of the election. Before we take a look at the state election polls, we should first take a look at this chart, because I think this chart can give a pretty accurate picture of how accurate the state election polls really are. Like the election polls that are taken within a single state, because the states are actually what determine the winner of the election. The national popular vote really doesn't matter much. It's a good metric for determining how much overall support each candidate has, but in the actual election, that metric doesn't really have any say in who wins and who loses. What actually matters is which states each candidate wins. So the actual percentage that each candidate gets within each state is what actually matters. That's what actually determines the winner of the election. So that's what we are going to take a look at now. But first, we're going to take a look at the 2016 election and how accurate the polls were for each state. So when people say that the 2016 polls weren't accurate, they're actually half right on that. I didn't talk about this in yesterday's video because I was planning on doing that in this part of the video, but I didn't have time for that yesterday, but they're actually half correct on that. The state polls weren't nearly as accurate as the national polls in the 2016 election. The state polls were off by several points in most of the states. Some of them predicted Trump winning states that Clinton won, and others predicted Clinton winning states that Trump won, like the Rust Belt. So when people say that the polls weren't accurate in 2016, they're right in that the state polls weren't accurate in 2016. But when they say that this polls underestimated Trump, that's also a bit misleading, because if you look at this chart, some of them actually underestimated Clinton by quite a few points. Look at Nevada, for example. Based on the polling average right before the election, leading up to the election 2016, just based on the polls taken specifically in Nevada, Trump was actually expected to win Nevada barely, but Clinton actually outperformed her expectations based on the polls and won Nevada by quite a few percentage points. I think it was 3 or 4 to be exact. Yeah, 3 percentage points, even though Trump was shown to be winning in the polls. So what this means is that the polls, yes, they're not that accurate when you look at the state level, but they're not favoring one candidate versus the other. People say a lot of the time that the polls in 2016 undercounted Trump supporters, Trump voters, but that's not necessarily true, because they also undercounted Clinton supporters, Clinton voters in certain states like Nevada and Arizona to a lesser extent, and Colorado. All the states that have Clinton in the difference column, those are the states that Clinton were underrepresented in the polls in, and the ones that have Trump in that column, in the difference column, the far right column, the ones with Trump in that column, they're the states that Trump was underrepresented in the polls and outperformed his expectations on actual election day. So states like Florida, Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all those states, Trump did better in the actual election than he did in the polls leading up to the election. But for states like Arizona, Colorado, and Nevada, Clinton did better in the real election than the polls predicted she would do. Here's one thing I will say though. The Rust Belt states, those polls taken in those states specifically, those polls underestimated how Trump would do by multiple points, especially if you take a look at Wisconsin, and also to a lesser extent Iowa and Ohio, but those states were already predicted to go for Trump. Trump just won them in bigger margins than expected. But Wisconsin's the one I want to take a look at, because that was one of the key states Trump won in 2016 that helped him win the election, and that's a state that Clinton was expected to win, but Trump actually ended up winning. If you take a look at the polling average leading up to the election versus how the election actually turned out, Clinton was expected to win Wisconsin by several percentage points, but then Trump ended up winning in a surprise turn of events. If you look at it from this perspective, then yes, the polls actually were kind of misleading in 2016. They underestimated Trump's chance of winning in any of the Rust Belt states. So from that aspect, I can see where people who say that the polls were inaccurate from in 2016, where they're coming from. If you look at each individual state and their polls taken specifically in that state, because I think the biggest reason for that is just the fact that you have a smaller amount of polls taken in each state. There's many more polls taken at the national level than taken in each individual state, and that's why I think the national polls, measuring the national popular vote, I think those polls are a lot more spot on than the polls taken at the state level, because you have a lot more of those polls taken at the national level, so they're a lot more likely to get an accurate picture of what the general electorate, the general population of the US thinks of each candidate. But if you go to the state level, you have fewer polls in each state than at the national level, so you're more likely to have an inaccurate picture right before election day of how each candidate's doing. But I guess Wisconsin and Michigan, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, all the Rust Belt states, as well as Iowa and Ohio, those polls overestimated Clinton's chances of winning and underestimated Trump's chances of winning. So I guess those polls at the state level didn't really predict how well Trump would actually do. And I guess those polls undercounted Trump's chance of winning. So I guess I can kind of see where people who say that the polls were inaccurate in 2016 are coming from. But I also want to clear up that what a lot of the time what they're saying is kind of misleading, because it's just those specific polls that were inaccurate at the state level. But if you look at the national level, they weren't that far off. I want to clear this up. I want to make this clear. National polls accurate, state polls less accurate, because a lot of people are going to point to the national polls that show Biden being up by like 6 to 7 percentage points and saying those underestimate Trump's voters also. And I would like to say that's not really the case. If you look at 2016, the polls didn't really underestimate Trump's support. They didn't really underestimate how much support Trump really had there, because the polls right before election day pretty accurately reflected what actually happened on election day. Clinton won by 2 percentage points on election day, but she was predicted to win by three. So the national election polls, they're almost spot on, but the state election polls, yeah, I'll admit, they're a bit more inaccurate. So I think it's not that good of idea to take a look at the state polls. I think it's a much better idea to focus more on the national polls. Even though the national popular vote doesn't really matter, doesn't really determine the outcome of the election, I think it's still a good way to look at how much support each candidate has overall, how much broad general support each candidate has. And the fact that Joe Biden is up by 6 percentage points in the polls on average just shows that Joe Biden overall has a lot more support than Donald Trump in this presidential election. Even though at the electoral college level, at the state level, Joe Biden might not be doing as well, because the Electoral College generally favors Republican candidates. Like in 2000, it favored Bush. In 2016, it favored Trump. But even then, I think Trump definitely does not have that good of a chance of winning this election. Biden's definitely favored to win this election. If you take a look at the national polls, Biden's winning by 6 percentage points. Generally, it's really hard to win the electoral vote when you're down by 6 percentage points in the popular vote. You have to have your electoral votes distributed in the exact right way. You have to have your support base distributed in the exact correct states in order to win the electoral college, even with a 6 point deficit in the national popular vote. I was going to originally make the last section of this video talking about how each candidate was doing at the state level in different swing states, how each candidate was doing in the polls in different states, but because I just talked about how the state polls weren't that accurate in 2016, I think that it's not really worth my time talking about the state polls now, considering that they're not that accurate. The reason why they're not that accurate, it's not that each individual poll is done badly, it's just that you can't get that good of a picture of the overall general support for each candidate unless you have a lot of polls. The national election polls, there's a lot of them. You have a steady stream of them. You have like sometimes multiple coming out each day. Because of that, you can get a pretty good picture of how each candidate's doing nationally. But at the state level, you just don't have that many polls at most of these swing states, and because of that, you can't really get that good of a picture of how they're doing. It's not the fact that the polls themselves are bad, it's just that you can't get that good of a picture of the overall support for each candidate unless you have a lot of them. Unless you can take the average of a higher amount of the polls, then only then can you get a good picture of the uh, support that each candidate has. You can look at this with the 2016 results, like I just talked about. Anyway, that's all I had to talk about. So if anyone tells you that the 2016 polls were inaccurate, ask them which polls they mean specifically. If they mean like the polls in general, including the national election polls, that's not accurate. And if they say the national polls weren't accurate, show them the polls leading up to the election in 2016 and show them the actual election outcome in 2016. On the other hand, though, if they say the state polls weren't that accurate, they kind of have a point there, because a lot of the states underpredicted one of the candidates in one way or another. Some of the polls in some of the states underrepresented Trump voters, while some of the polls in other states underrepresented Clinton voters. If they say that the polls exclusively underrepresented Trump, though, I don't think that's an accurate statement, because some of the polls underrepresented Trump, yes, or some of the states, sorry, but other states underrepresented Clinton in the polls. So it went both ways in 2016. So just clear that up if someone makes that claim. Generally, national election polls accurate, state election polls not quite as accurate. But I think the video can end now. I hope you enjoyed today's video and I hope you tune into tomorrow's video. See you then.